Welcome to the Future of Supply Chain, presented by Dynamo. Each episode, we sit down with leaders in the industry as we build the future of supply chain together. Let's get into the show. Here's our host, Santosh Sankar.
Hey, ladies and gents, welcome back to the Future Supply Chain podcast. I'm your host, Santosh Sankar. Joining me today is Andrea Limbago, SVP of Applied AI at interos.ai. Welcome, Andrea.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. And we're going to cover a lot of ground today. Yes. But before we jump in, I would love for you to just share a bit about Interos with our listeners who may not be as familiar.
Right. Yeah. No, we saw in the startup phase. We're a supply chain risk management company. And so we have a SaaS platform where we have an AI-driven supply chain risk modeling platform for our customers. And so what they can do is look across a whole range of supply chain risks, everything from cyber risk, geopolitical, financial, climate change, all within one holistic platform and all AI-driven and automated with risk factors across each of those areas to enable both strategic planning, and we complement that as well with continuous monitoring so they can stay on top and better prepare and understand how a lot of the chaos in the world actually impacts their supply chain.
As I was preparing for this episode, the thing I reflected on with Madison was you've been able to kind of sit in the middle of three really large things. Yeah. Cybersecurity, AI, and supply chains. And I would say maybe two of those things nobody would have expected would be household subject matter in 2025. But what's the Andrew story? How did this all come to be?
Yeah, it's been a very circuitous path, and I'd even almost throw one more big blob on there of geopolitics. So and that as well is an area that, say, 5 years ago, people weren't necessarily thinking was going to be a kitchen table conversation. And so I started off in academia, did a lot of quantitative modeling on the intersection of basically economic statecraft and international conflict, which, at the time, a couple decades ago, there actually wasn't a lot of interest in economic statecraft. And so from there, I through that work in academia, I taught briefly, but then went to the Department of Defense and really leveraged a lot of the quantitative modeling capabilities then. Around that time was big data. So kind of have seen the evolution from quantitative modeling to big data to now AI. And my career path has kind of traveled along that way. So once when I was in the Department of Defense, did a lot of big data modeling. And that's also where I got exposed to cybersecurity. And that was, again, when cybersecurity, you think about prior to the Sony breach in about 2014, wasn't a household topic, not really. And so the Department of Defense was really the place where you would get exposed to something like that. They were thinking about that for quite some time prior to that. And then from there, I went on and did a series of startups that basically did something adjacent to the Department of Defense, doing some defense contracting, and then went into an endpoint detection company called Endgame, and then into encryption, and now into supply chain risk. And I really look at Interos as bringing together the whole path of my career into one place, bringing together the quantitative modeling and evolving into AI and everything from the geopolitical component and all the different cybersecurity components, all within a broader globalization and economic statecraft view. And so it kind of brings my whole career somehow full circle. Definitely wasn't planned.
And so I'd love to, I guess, better understand also, you lead Applied AI at Interos. How should people think about kind of your remit, your responsibilities, but also for many, the question of what does Applied AI mean is also likely running through their minds.
Oh, it is. Well, and I would even argue, for some, depending, what is AI still remains a very broad question, and you're not going to get the same answer from two people. Unfortunately, there are some regulations now, or some different kinds of the major organizations are defining AI in some ways that we can at least be consistent to that. But on the applied AI side, really what we do is leverage and implement AI to solve real world problems. And so you can think about, on the one hand, there's great general research going on in AI that may not necessarily be within a certain domain trying to solve a specific problem. What we do is really take all the great advances that have been made, innovations that have been made, especially over the last couple of years, and apply them specifically to the domain space. And so I have folks on my team, I've got a climate scientist who can work on the various aspects of climate change and catastrophic risk and applying that to supply chain. But that person may not have the same skill set as being able to do financial risk, who may not have the same skill set and understanding of the data for cyber. And so bring together all these different domain expertise with the commonality of data science and modeling, and really apply AI into those domains so that we're leveraging the right data at the right time for the right insights and input for our customers.
Maybe we kind of go on this reflective exercise over the last 12 months or so. I'd be interested in kind of understanding from your purview, which key events do you see kind of really demonstrating the importance of geopolitics, cyber, colliding kind of with this concept of supply chain that a lot of people, frankly, I found forgot about it a couple years ago because kind of COVID era issues had kind of settled down. It felt like business as usual, but it's reared its head once again, and you can't ever run away from it.
Yeah, no, it has. I mean, everyone's got their toilet paper now, so that we're kind of past that a little bit. But yeah, I mean, there are a whole range of disruptions that you can think about that are still ongoing. And for me, when I look at some of the big ones that have the geopolitical component to it, there are a handful of that kind of go into different areas. And so one of the big ones that just passed the 1 year mark anniversary was the Hezbollah pager attacks. If you remember those from a year ago. And so that was really when the explosives were implanted within the pagers and walkie-talkies. There's all sorts of, there were front companies. I mean, it was a extraordinarily intricate attack, carried out by the Israelis targeting Hezbollah leaders. Killed dozens, but injured thousands. Like, it really was the first time we saw such a level of lethality through a supply chain attack like that. And that, in many regards, we've been waiting to see. It was at a turning point in how in supply chain warfare really was something that, and we would considering. We haven't seen anything to that scale, fortunately, and because don't want to see that level of lethality. However, it's one of those things where like Pandora's box is open now, and so it really has shifted the norms. And so wouldn't be surprised if other states are going to be pursuing something similar in the future.
Sure.
And so that's just one. And so that's one big one. Another big one is the Salt Typhoon attacks, the cyber attacks. So again, supply chain attack, Chinese linked malicious actors, cyber actors, basically compromising the major telecom companies in the United States. But those telecom companies weren't necessarily the target, right? It was their customers that were the targets. That's what makes the supply chain component of it within cyber warfare. And that really, some of the senators have called that the biggest breach in the U.S. in history. And so you've got that big event happening. And then almost along the lines of logistics and transportation, Ukraine spiderweb attack that just happened a few months ago. And from that, there's news now they created a front company in Russia that had a warehouse, had factories, and they basically leveraged transportation routes within Russia to sneak in drones and go in thousands of miles into Russia and then attack some of their military sites. And that, again, unprecedented, seeing something like that. And if you look just across those three examples, like they're so extraordinarily different in so many different ways, but you see the intersection of technology and the cyber components and all linked to various aspects of supply chain. So it's really nuanced and multifaceted, the different ways that we're going to be seeing supply chains weaponized, already have, and we'll probably likely continue to see that happen in the future.
Now, kind of sitting here late September, a bit removed from kind of when these incidents happened, has anything changed to either for the positive or the negative as we kind of think about what is the next one? Are we actually maybe more predisposed to more of these happening? Are we actually in an improved position that these things may not happen as regularly or frequently, or maybe no, nothing's changed?
I'm not sure much has changed. I think the risk is still there. I think, you're going to start seeing copycat. Maybe perhaps not the same scale, because in all of these, they require state level resources, and that's an important thing. Unlike some of the other cyber attacks that really could just be, a script kiddie or any person could do. These were very complex state resources required. However, when you see something that requires state resources, doesn't mean that other governments may not also similarly want to do something along those lines. So I think it really it was a level of creativity in many ways that then can prompt ideas for other people to to follow suit. So I'm not necessarily sure. If anything, I do think it's introduced just really a big shift in how supply chains should be viewed going forward for additional level of risk and disruption through the weaponization of supply chains. And I don't think that's something that necessarily is on everyone's radar yet.
Shifting gears perhaps into kind of more micro and around Interos and Interos' offering. The big thing when you think about supply chains are suppliers and supplier disruption.
Yeah.
And it's kind of this perennial question that either we face from kind of various corporate stakeholders in our network, or we see our portfolio companies, other stakeholders, constituents face. But as I kind of think about Interos, are there some kind of key and perhaps even simple leading indicators of supplier disruption? And I'd be curious how one should kind of read those indicators or those data points to determine what's happening.
Yeah. On the one hand, I think we can look for, there's so much noise, right, across all these different areas. And so on the one hand, it can be very hard to sort through that. And that's where technology really is going to have to come into play. One of the key challenges as well with supply chains that the data is all over the place. And so it's not necessarily similar to some other areas. I mean, you think about even looking at the stock market, like that data is pretty well structured, well organized in one place, makes forecasting prediction and so forth. I'd argue much easier. And even in that area, it's hard, right?
That's
supply
right.
chains, you've got all this external data, plus you've got so much of it also is proprietary within the company. And so I'd say one of the key things is to bring that data together, and then you can start looking at some of the leading indicators. But absent doing some of that, because that alone becomes very hard. Not everyone has the resources to do so. I think really setting yourself up to understand what the range of the risks are, and then looking at where might you have some geographic concentration, where might you have some product concentration, where are your single sources. It's almost like knowing yourself to know where your biggest risks are, and then keeping an eye on those areas for what might be, anything that might be coming along the lines to disrupt them, whether it's a hurricane coming in at one of your factories, whether you have potential financial bankruptcy, outbreak of war, like really looking at that holistically, I think is probably the better way to do it. There isn't that silver bullet of you watch this one data point and you're going to know that boat got caught in the Suez Canal. Like unfortunately, on the one hand, so many of these big disruptions are black swan events, but they're happening over and over again. And so they're not really black swan events anymore, because that's against the definition.
Yeah.
So, but they also are things that perhaps have not happened before. And it's very hard for prediction on things that have not happened before.
Yeah.
That's kind of the world we're in right now.
And so kind of continuing with this kind of thought of suppliers, especially when I speak to our friends in automotive, the big question is like, how do I look beyond kind of my tier ones, right? I have tier twos, I have tier threes, and then kind of as I think about their value chains, that unravels in a certain way. And a big question they always ask is like, so how do we look a few layers down? Is this a thing? Do you have kind of interesting suggestions as to how we might build, or kind of startups that we should partner with? And I'd be curious, like what have you found to be good enough in this regard, having, tier 1 through N visibility, but also does that change depending on whether you're a large organization versus a small organization?
Yeah, that absolutely does. And what's good enough might also, I think you almost could think about you having some sort of matrix, size of the organization, and then what your risk tolerance might be. And because different companies, even within automotive, some may not have risk tolerance at all, and some may have extreme risk tolerance. And so what I'd argue is, looking at what's your tier one, actually even making sure that you first even know what your tier one is, because that actually, for very large corporations, that may not even all be in one spot for them. For smaller companies, it's easier, but then they have fewer resources to pull that information together. But from there, it really does require integrating diverse data through technology, because for the big companies, they've got hundreds of thousands of suppliers. Like that's just not something that a human can monitor. It gets beyond the scope of that. And so you have to do the interplay of the company and the domain expertise from what their suppliers might be, leverage technology to help build it out. And then from there, it will depend, because you've got some retailers that might be very concerned whether or not they are linked back to unethical labor in Xinjiang province, for instance, but that may not be the highest priority for perhaps in aerospace and defense. We're really looking at the security components of the technologies that they're building. And so in each case of those, really understanding where your risk tolerance is, what are some of the key concerns that you're worried about, and making sure you can address those first. That then can help guide the broader strategy in that regard. And I think often companies find what they thought was good enough turns out to not be good enough due to something ends up surprising them. And so I also would say really think creatively about it, and try and introduce elements of surprise and whether or not you have visibility to even see if something might impact you. And I think that links back to all the tariff discussions that have been going on.
Yeah.
So all the regulatory shifts. On one hand, it perhaps may not have been a surprise. We knew this during parts of the election, was talked about quite a bit, but at the same time, still seems to have surprised people. And so, looking a bit ahead and seeing some of the signs of where things might be shifting and preparing for those is one good way to really figure out how, what level of visibility you need, and then in what areas.
I guess as I kind of hear you talk through that, I'm wondering, it's kind of simulation almost part of it, because we kind of use the word black swan, and some of these disruptions that have occurred are happening more frequently, and they're of a similar ilk. So they certainly may not qualify as a black swan, but being creative and almost pressure testing kind of the system a company has built, should people start to adopt almost like a simulation based mindset as to think about realistic but very outlandish risks that could occur, and then figure out how that impacts your value chain. What is the result? And then based on that, you could have mitigation efforts, so to speak. Is that something you see or you might explore more?
I think you're starting to see a little bit of that. And you start to see, so in cybersecurity, there's incident response and incident response planning. And to various levels, some of the big corporations have this down very, very well. Some of the smaller companies just simply don't have the resources. But it doesn't necessarily require a ton, but having those scenarios for incident response planning for if a cyber attack were to happen to that company, what would they do? And making sure all the right people are in the room. And you almost could apply that same mindset to a supply chain risk and supply chain risk disruption. If a disruption happens, what would we do? And that's where, on the one hand, you can leverage technology to highlight, here are your concentration risks, here's your single sources of failure. Here's some companies that look like they might be, financially uncertain. And then you can leverage, more on the human side, building out scenarios, do tabletop exercises on what would happen if that company goes under, what would happen if an earthquake happens in that area where we've got a key supplier, and playing those out through a range of tabletop exercises. And that's again where I always see the interaction of the technology, but then the human element as well have to go together. So it is a whole people process technology, right? It's innovating across all three of those that's required.
So kind of further digging into supply chains, the supply chain or the hallmark of supply chain is full of fixed physical points. There's also kind of moving physical elements like ships and planes. But as I think about kind of potential cyber physical weak spots, right? Ports are notorious. Warehouses also are very well known. Factories in an era where we're talking about reindustrialization.
Yep.
Which points worry you the most with regards to their vulnerability, and how should people be thinking about managing these vulnerabilities or kind of reducing them?
Yeah, it's extremely difficult. Especially if you've got multiple. The range of some of these companies that have factories and warehouses across the globe, that becomes extraordinarily difficult. But one of the key things what I think that gets lost a bit is the cybersecurity component of those. And if you look at Jaguar, what they're going through right now with the cyber attack, and so it's basically disrupted all production. It's been several weeks and still disrupted. And while they've refuted, some are concerned it might last till November. Like that could lead to their suppliers then going bankrupt, right?
Yeah.
And so we have a real world case going on right now where cybersecurity is dramatically impacting factory output, and that's kind of that's where I don't think that necessarily, it was not the first time that's happened. Probably won't be the last time that's happened, but I think it's almost, if you think about what Toyota went through following the earthquake and tsunami, and really learned how to diversify the supply chain. Like I feel like there could be lessons learned here, what's going on now on the cyber front, for other companies to really learn how to be resilient against these kind of attacks, to figure out if any part of the company gets attacked in those regards, how will it impact the factories? Are there certain factories that you might diversify the networks on them so some of them can still be up and running while the other ones are trying to remediate the attack? And so I think just having broader cybersecurity considerations and basic cyber hygiene really across all aspects of it. I mean, in many regards, some of the more foundational components, such as multi-factor authentication, encryption, and so forth, may or may not be a top priority. But I think increasingly it should be to at least provide that basic baseline level of security. But I mean, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, because I think it potentially could be a wake up call. But again, I think we often hear, oh, this attack will be the wake up call for whole industries. Then it turns out that that's not really, and people just say, oh, that won't happen to me.
So equally, what's happening is attackers, bad actors, are getting more creative, and we've certainly seen versions of this across the supply chain, whether it's more traditional attack vectors or equally kind of ransomware, compromising business email, and even kind of deep fakes, as people are trying to kind of compromise perhaps valuable cargo is what we've run into in our world. But for kind of the logistics audience now kind of listening in, and even kind of the procurement audience, what should they do in order to kind of harden processes with their suppliers, communications? And at the end of the day, it all comes down to money, some way, shape, or form. Perhaps even kind of the role maybe payments might play in avoiding kind of some of these sticky situations.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting. I think on the one hand, security is increasingly getting introduced into contracts. So I think having a level of that within from the start within contracts, having that as a requirement. At the same time, what we increasingly see is something called there's basically a cyber poverty line, where those above a certain level can afford to have good cybersecurity and those below cannot. On the side of sort of process innovation, what we're seeing are some major companies who know they've got very important suppliers helping provide some of that cybersecurity for their important suppliers that can't afford it on their own. And so it's almost like whether it's providing like a red teaming support or other kinds of security support. I think that the larger companies, if they know they've got a critical supplier that may not have the resources to get at the level of security they want, they can help step in and collaborate and cooperate in those regards. And so I think those are some additional venues or avenues to look at. But then again, I think just ensuring that there is that cooperation and ensuring that there's an incident response plan with your suppliers as well, that if they are hit, making sure they know who to call within your organization to let them know that your own data might be at risk and your own security might be at risk, because that could be the way into your company. And so also having that, knowing what phone number to dial, which is almost very simple, but it that doesn't always happen.
It sounds very akin to kind of the age-old business continuity efforts, where like nobody wants to talk about it. It's not sexy. It can be rather boring formulating those processes. But when something happens, it's important to have that on standby to execute.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And then challenges with transitions of employees as well that we see going on right now, making sure that as employees transition out, someone's taken over that responsibility.
So, last question here before we wrap up. We've mentioned the word Black Swan, but alongside Black Swan, Nassim Taleb also coined the concept of anti-fragility. And during COVID, we wrote about anti-fragility and the concept being applied to supply chains. But the reason kind of we've even had this discussion today is because we're trying to make something more resilient. And the more you pressure it, the better it gets, is kind of the gist of being anti-fragile. But how should people think about resilience? Because it's a term that like you'll even pick up in board meetings or quarterly investor calls and earnings calls. But how should management teams practically quantify resilience? Because if they quantify it, that gives them a greater chance of being able to manage it or manage a business to resilience. Yeah, no,
it's a great question. I think this is also an evolving area. I mean, on the one hand, something could be as almost basic as the number of supply chain disruptions and the frequency of that. So whether it's disruptions to services or disruptions to product creation, whatever the company is in, making that relevant to them and being sure to define what a supply chain disruption is as well, to make sure that you know what you're actually measuring.
Yeah.
I mean, I think leveraging risk scores across all of your suppliers, so you know, and trying to bring that risk level down. So quantifying risk across your suppliers, and if it happens to be you've got a concentration of high risk in certain areas, working on a metric to bring that down below a certain point. Anything even along the lines of like downtime and response time to certain events, and so making sure that the response plans are part of it. And then not to even say like making sure you have a response plan. So maybe you don't even have one yet.
Yeah.
And so putting that as an objective by the end of the quarter, we're going to have a response plan, and then we're going to have a tabletop exercise, every quarter, annually, and make sure you update it as well on some certain cadence. And so just making sure those even exist are very important.
Amazing. Well, with that, Andrea, I'm going to bring us home in a fun way. I called this this or that. I'm going to give you two options. I would love for you to kind of pick the immediate option that comes to mind, and in 20 seconds, express why.
Okay.
Cool.
Got it. I'm ready.
All right. First up, your single source hero or multi-source redundancy?
Always multi-source redundancy. I got to be in supply chain. Big fan of diversification. Got to minimize my risk. The single source hero is just a big target to be attacked. So definitely want it. And I understand that almost gets at the just in time versus just in case transition that's been going on.
Yeah.
So that's why.
Next up, detect today or predict tomorrow?
Yes, in an ideal world, both. That would be amazing. I would lean first towards detect today, because if you're not detecting today, you may not be able to be around to predict tomorrow. And so you start off on making sure you can survive until tomorrow. But once you have the detection capabilities in place, that actually gives you the foundation to start doing some of that prediction. So it almost has to be sequential.
And then last but not least, trust vendors or verify continuously?
Oh, verify continuously. Again, bring back a cybersecurity notion of zero trust. So it basically is, don't trust, verify is the TLDR on that.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't mean that, you're not being a bad partner, but you need to make sure that, they may not even know what they don't know. Right. And so always have to verify and validate.
Amazing. Well, with that, Andrea, thank you for indulging us here in a variety of subject matter, but all in the name of supply chain resilience.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for a fun conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Fingers crossed that there's nothing too disruptive here as we head into the holiday season.
Let's hope.
Be well.
Thanks for watching. Follow us at dynamo.vc for all the latest episodes. We'll see you next time.